The first time I saw the chalet, it felt like the perfect place to disappear. It sat at the edge of a dense pine forest, framed by towering mountains that seemed to block out the rest of the world. A long dirt road, more potholes than path, led me to its front door. I remember thinking that if solitude could take shape, this was it. A place where no one would find me, where memories might lose their grip. That's all I wanted. To be alone with my thoughts. To forget everything. Rachel's death was like a switch flipping off the lights in my life. One minute we were laughing over dinner. The next, she was gone. A drunk driver. An intersection she should have crossed without a second thought. I couldn't stay in Seattle after that. Everywhere I went, I saw her. A ghost in a coffee shop window. The hum of her favorite songs at the grocery store. It was unbearable. So, I packed up my life and drove to Colorado, chasing silence. The chalet wasn't anything special. 2 bedrooms, a creaky staircase, and walls that seemed to shiver every time the wind blew. But it had a charm, I guess. A worn wooden porch wrapped around the house, overlooking the kind of view people pay thousands for on vacation. And the best part? There were no neighbors, no traffic sounds, no reminders of life outside. Just me, the trees, and the occasional call of some bird I couldn't name. I thought it'd be enough. For a few days it was. I spent my time unpacking, trying to find some semblance of routine. Mornings with coffee on the porch. Afternoons hiking trails that felt like they hadn't seen a human in decades. Nights were harder, though. That's when the quiet became heavy, like it was pressing down on me, daring me to fill it. It was during one of those nights that I first heard it. A melody, faint and distant, drifting through the woods like smoke. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe I'd left the radio on by accident, or maybe the wind was carrying some sound from miles away. But when I stepped outside to investigate, the music grew clearer. It wasn't just random notes. It was a song, haunting and familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. It stopped abruptly, leaving me standing there in the cold, staring into the darkness like a fool. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe some hiker with a portable speaker, or some local tradition I didn't know about. But deep down, it unsettled me. Something about the way the sound moved, how it felt so personal, sent a shiver through me that had nothing to do with the chill in the air. The next day, I drove into town to stock up on supplies. It was a small place, the kind where everyone seemed to know each other. The general store smelled like sawdust and coffee, and the woman behind the counter, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, rang up my items with a polite smile. "New around here?" she asked, her tone casual but curious. "Yeah," I said. "Bought the old Harlan place up near the woods." Her face changed at that. Just a flicker, like she'd heard something she didn't like. "That's a quiet spot," she said, carefully neutral. "That's the idea," I replied, trying to keep things light. "You know, I heard something strange last night. Music. Does anyone out here play, I don't know, violin or something?" She paused, her hands stilling over the register. "Music, you say?" "Yeah, it was faint but eerie, almost like a lullaby." The polite smile was gone now. She looked past me, like she was debating whether or not to say something. Before she could answer, a man stacking cans nearby chimed in. "Best not to go chasing noises in those woods," he said, his voice low and serious. I laughed awkwardly. "Why's that?" "Just some things are better left alone." The woman shot him a look that shut him up, then handed me my change. "Take care up there," she said. "Winters can be rough." I nodded, pretending not to notice how her fingers trembled slightly as she handed me the bag. That night the music came back. This time it was louder, clearer, as if it were coming from inside the house. My chest tightened as I followed the sound, each step feeling heavier than the last. It led me upstairs to a door I hadn't opened yet. A small, forgotten room tucked into the corner of the house. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the only furniture was an old wooden table. Sitting on it, like it had been waiting for me, was a gramophone. The needle wasn't moving, and there was no record spinning on the turntable, but the music was unmistakable. A soft, mournful tune that sent chills racing down my spine. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood there, staring at the thing, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was some kind of mechanical glitch. Or maybe... No, that was crazy. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. Carved into the side of the gramophone, faint but deliberate, were the initials RB. Rachel Bennett, my wife's initials. The moment I saw Rachel's initials carved into that gramophone, my stomach flipped. It didn't make any sense. She'd never owned one of these. Hell, I wasn't even sure she'd ever seen one in her life. Still, there it was. carved neatly into the wood, like a message left just for me. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that melody looping in my head, soft and haunting, like it was trying to pull me back to that room. When the sun finally came up, I decided to go back and take another look. Maybe I'd missed something in the haze of exhaustion. The gramophone was still there, silent now, as if it had never played a single note. I ran my fingers over the initials again, tracing the familiar curves of Rachel's handwriting. The more I stared at it, the more certain I became. It wasn't just a coincidence. This had to mean something. I searched the room, hoping for answers. The air was thick with dust, and every step I took stirred up a cloud that clung to my throat. There wasn't much to go through. A few warped floorboards, an old wooden trunk in the corner. I pried it open, half expecting to find more clues, but all it held was a pile of moth-eaten blankets and a rusted lantern. Frustrated, I turned back to the gramophone. I tried to pick it up, but it wouldn't budge, like it was bolted to the table. It didn't make sense. There were no screws or nails holding it down. It was just stuck. That was when I noticed the scratches on the table. They were faint, almost hidden beneath layers of grime, but they formed a pattern. Concentric circles, like someone had been spinning something over and over. I ran my hand over the grooves, a chill creeping up my spine. The melody played in my head again, clearer now, almost as if the gramophone wanted me to hear it. I stepped back, heart pounding, and left the room, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself. I went for a hike, chopped some firewood, even tried to sketch the view from the porch, but none of it worked. The gramophone was always there in the back of my mind, waiting. That night the music started again, louder this time, more insistent, as if it were calling me. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. Every note felt like it was burrowing into my skull, pulling me toward that room. When I finally gave in and opened the door, the gramophone was playing, even though the turntable wasn't moving. The melody filled the space, wrapping around me like a cold wind. And then, just as I was about to step closer, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There was a photograph on the table. I hadn't noticed it before. It was an old faded Polaroid, the edges curled and yellowed with time. In it, Rachel was sitting on a porch I didn't recognize, her hair swept back by the wind. She was smiling, that same smile that used to light up every room she walked into. I grabbed the photo, my hands trembling. On the back, in her handwriting, was a date, July 14th, 2019, the day we'd celebrated our anniversary. But there was something off about the photo. I couldn't place it at first, but the more I stared, the more wrong it felt. Her eyes, they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking past it, at something or someone just out of frame. I shoved the photo into my pocket and left the room, slamming the door again. The next day, I drove back to town, clutching the photo like it was some kind of lifeline. I went straight to the general store, hoping to find answers. The old woman behind the counter greeted me with a wary smile. Back so soon? I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I pulled the photo from my pocket and set it on the counter. Do you recognize this place? Her smile faltered. She picked up the photo and studied it, her brow furrowing. Where did you find this? In my house, I said. Up in the woods. Do you know where this was taken? She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the man who'd warned me the last time I was there. He stepped closer, glancing at the photo over her shoulder. His face darkened. That's the old Harlan porch, he said quietly. Your place. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. That's impossible. She's never been there. The old woman set the photo down carefully, her hands trembling. You should leave that place, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Some things aren't meant to be disturbed. I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but something in her expression stopped me. It wasn't just fear, it was pity. That night the music came back, louder and clearer than ever before. And this time I heard something else, whispering my name. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? The sound of my name, whispered over and over, clawed at my sanity. It wasn't just the melody anymore. Something was speaking to me. The voice was soft, almost soothing, but it carried an edge of menace that made my skin crawl. It started with a single word, Hugo, a gentle call, like someone trying to wake me from a dream. Then it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the house, ricocheting off the walls and slithering under the door. I tried everything to drown it out. Turned on the TV, played music on my phone, even covered my ears with a pillow. Nothing worked. The voice wasn't just in the air, it was inside me, echoing in my skull. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing the lantern I'd found in the trunk, I stomped upstairs, determined to confront whatever was in that room. The door creaked open, and the music greeted me like an old friend, spinning its sinister web. The gramophone was spinning now, though there was still no record on the turntable. The scratches on the table had deepened, as if the needle had carved them into the wood. And standing there, bathed in the faint glow of the lantern, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just the darkness of the room. It moved, independent of the flickering light, its form shifting like smoke caught in a breeze. It loomed near the gramophone, almost touching it, and I felt a deep, primal fear take root in my chest. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The shadow didn't answer. Instead, the voice came again, this time clearer, resonating from every corner of the room. "Listen," it said. The gramophone's melody swelled, wrapping around me like a cocoon. For a moment, I felt safe. Rachel's face flickered in my mind, her laughter, her touch, the way she used to hum this very tune while cooking dinner. It was like she was there, reaching out to me. But then, the memories began to twist. Her laughter turned into sobs. Her face blurred, then vanished altogether, replaced by a black void that felt endless. My knees buckled, and I gripped the table for support. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice cracking. "Stop it!" The shadow shifted, and the voice softened, almost pleading. "Don't you want to remember?" Something in me broke. I grabbed the gramophone, ignoring the way my fingers burned against the cold metal, and tried to hurl it across the room. But it wouldn't move. It was like it was rooted to the table, immovable. The voice laughed, a low, hollow sound that made the room vibrate. "You can't fight me," it said. "You brought me here, you called me." "I didn't call you!" I shouted. The shadow grew, swallowing the walls of the room, and I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me. Images flashed before my eyes. Rachel at the piano, her hands gliding over the keys. The accident, the shattered glass, the rain-soaked pavement. But then, something else. Me, sitting in the dark after her funeral, whispering her name like a prayer. I realized what it meant. In my grief, in my desperation to feel her presence again, I had called out to her, or at least I thought I had. But something else had answered. The shadow lunged toward me, and I stumbled back, knocking over the lantern. The flame flickered and then roared to life, spreading across the dusty floorboards. The room filled with smoke, the fire licking at the walls, but the shadow didn't retreat. It moved through the flames, unbothered, and the voice grew louder. "You can't escape me, Hugo, you're mine." I ran, choking on the smoke, barely making it down the stairs before the fire consumed the upper floor. Outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap, but the music followed. It poured out of the house, louder and more chaotic, a discordant symphony that made my ears ring. I turned to watch the flames engulf the chalet, the orange glow lighting up the forest. The roof caved in with a deafening crash, and for a moment, the music stopped. I thought it was over. But then I heard it again, faint and distant, carried on the wind. The gramophone was still playing. I sank to my knees, staring at the burning wreckage, my chest heaving. I realized then that I couldn't fight it. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't bound by the rules of the world I knew. Fire couldn't destroy it. Running wouldn't save me. And worse, I knew I couldn't stop listening. The music had its hooks in me now, buried deep. Every note pulled me closer, stripping away pieces of myself I didn't even realize I was losing. I didn't just hear the melody. I felt it, coursing through my veins, replacing everything that made me, me. Somewhere in the back of my mind I understood what was happening. I was becoming hollow, and the music was just getting started. I sat outside the burning chalet, shivering in the cold mountain air, watching the flames devour everything I'd brought with me. I thought I'd feel relief, like I'd finally destroyed the thing that had been haunting me. But the music, it was still there, faint and teasing, coming from the woods this time, echoing through the trees like it was mocking me. I don't know how long I sat there frozen in place, but eventually, the silence between the notes became unbearable. I couldn't just sit and wait for it to come back. I had to end this, somehow. With nothing left to lose, I grabbed a flashlight from the car and stumbled into the forest, following the melody. It seemed to twist and shift as I walked, always just out of reach. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but endless trees. Every now and then I thought I saw a shadow darting between the trunks, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The further I went, the louder the music grew. My memories started slipping away again. Rachel's face, the sound of her laugh, even the pain of losing her. It all felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. I knew I was running out of time. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center, surrounded by a ring of jagged stones, was the gramophone. It looked untouched, as if it had never been in the fire. The turntable was spinning now, even though there was still no record. The music swirled around me, beautiful and terrible, pulling me closer. "You can't destroy me, Hugo," the voice whispered, no longer just in my head. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "I've been here long before you, and I'll be here long after. You're nothing but a fleeting memory, and soon, even that will be gone." I stepped into the clearing, my fists clenched. "You can take everything," I said, my voice trembling. "But you won't take her." The voice laughed, deep and hollow, and the shadow from the chalet began to form again, rising from the ground like smoke. It loomed over me, dark and endless, blocking out the stars. I don't know where the idea came from. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe some part of me finally understood what I was dealing with. Either way, I didn't hesitate. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the photo of Rachel I'd taken from the gramophone room. "This is what you want, isn't it?" I shouted, holding it up. The shadow paused, its form flickering, and the music faltered for the first time. "You've been feeding on my memories, but you can't take this," I said, my voice steadying. "This is all I have left of her, and if you want it, you'll have to come and take it." The shadow surged forward, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, sharper than any winter wind. It wrapped around me, pulling at the photo, pulling at me, and for a moment, I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. My vision blurred, and I felt myself slipping away, my memories unraveling like threads. But then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I let go. I let go of the photo, let go of Rachel, let go of everything I'd been clinging to since the day she died. The shadow enveloped the photo, devouring it, and for the first time, the music stopped. The silence was deafening. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The gramophone was gone, the shadow was gone, and for the first time in months, I felt free. But freedom came at a cost. I stumbled back through the forest, the world around me unfamiliar and strange. By the time I reached the road, I realized I couldn't remember why I'd come to the chalet in the first place. I couldn't remember Rachel's face or the sound of her voice. I couldn't even remember what she meant to me. All that was left was a vague sense of loss, like a hole where something important had once been. I drove away from the mountain that night, not knowing where I was going or who I was anymore. The gramophone had taken what it wanted, and it had left me hollow, just like it promised. Weeks later, I saw a news story about a young couple who had bought the land where the chalet once stood. The headline mentioned strange music coming from the woods, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark, trying to remember why the story bothered me so much. But no matter how hard I tried, the answer wouldn't come. Somewhere in the depths of the forest, the music had started playing again, and it was waiting for its next victim. I didn't want to go back to that house, not after everything that happened. But when my mom passed, there was no one else to deal with her estate. So, there I was, driving through winding roads in the middle of nowhere, with the kind of gray sky that looks like it's been crying for days. It felt like the perfect backdrop for what I knew would be a miserable week. The house itself sat at the edge of a dense forest, a little too far from civilization for comfort. It looked the same as I remembered from my teenage years, big, old, and a little creepy. The paint was peeling off the shutters, and the front porch sagged just enough to make me hesitate before stepping on it. For a second, I swore I saw something move behind the curtain of an upstairs window. My stomach twisted, but I shook it off. It's just an old house. They creak, they settle. Nothing weird about that. Inside, it smelled like dust and faded memories, the kind of smell that makes you sneeze and feel nostalgic all at once. I dropped my bags in the hallway and sighed. "All right, let's get this over with," I muttered to myself. My first priority was to clean out my mom's bedroom. She always kept that space off limits when I was growing up, and honestly, I wasn't in a rush to invade it now. Still, it felt like the right place to start. The room was surprisingly neat, like she'd been expecting someone to come snooping. Everything had its place, except for the giant, antique mirror leaning against the wall near the bed. That was new, or at least new to me. The mirror was beautiful in a kind of unsettling way. Its gold frame was intricately carved with vines and flowers, but some parts looked like they were faces, tiny, warped faces twisted in anguish. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't stop staring. Something about it felt off. I could have sworn my reflection was moving a little slower than me, like there was a slight lag. It creeped me out enough to throw a sheet over it. Problem solved. I didn't get much done that first day. Cleaning turned into a lot of sitting on the edge of the bed, flipping through old photo albums and wondering why my mom had held on to every little thing from my childhood, but never bothered to tell me half of what I wanted to know about hers. By the time the sun started setting, I was more emotionally drained than physically tired. That's when the knock came at the door. It was Martha, the neighbor from 2 houses down, or rather the only other house within a mile radius. She was the kind of old lady who looked like she knew everything about everyone and didn't mind telling you about it. She handed me a casserole dish with one hand and clutched a rosary with the other. "Figured you could use something warm to eat," she said, her eyes darting nervously toward the house. "You shouldn't be here alone, though. That place has always been strange." I forced a polite smile. "Thanks, but I'll be fine. It's just a house." Her expression turned serious. "It's not just a house, Clara. Your mom." She started talking about seeing things in that mirror of hers. Said it showed her things she didn't want to see. "You be careful with it." I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but I laughed it off. I'll keep that in mind. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Martha said. It was ridiculous, of course. A mirror couldn't show things. Still, when I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. The sounds didn't help. The faint creaks, the distant thumps. Every time I closed my eyes, it felt like something was moving just out of sight. Finally, I gave in. I got out of bed and went back to the bedroom where the mirror was. The sheet I'd thrown over it earlier looked like it had shifted, but that was probably just my imagination. I pulled it off, letting the fabric fall to the floor, and stared at my reflection. For a long time, nothing happened. It was just me, looking tired and a little pale. But then, just as I was about to turn away, something flickered. It wasn't much, just a quick flash, like a distant memory trying to surface. I leaned in closer, but whatever it was gone. That's when I noticed the edge of a paper sticking out from under the mirror. I bent down to grab it, my hands trembling for no reason I could explain. It was a note, written in my mom's shaky handwriting. "Look closely, Clara, you'll see the truth." My stomach sank. What truth? What was she talking about? I stared at the mirror again, waiting for something to happen. And for a second, I thought I saw movement. Not from me, but from the reflection. It was subtle, just enough to make me question if I was imagining it. I backed away, my heart pounding, and left the room, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just the stress, the exhaustion, the grief, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. The next morning I woke up with a splitting headache and the distinct feeling that I hadn't slept alone. Not in the someone else in the house way, but in the something watching you all night way. The thought was ridiculous, of course. It had to be the stress or the leftover weirdness from finding that note. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling as I made coffee in the dusty kitchen. The house was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, making you hyper-aware of every tiny creak and rustle. I tried to push it aside. There was work to do after all, clothes to sort, papers to sift through, and probably some long-expired food to throw out. But my mind kept wandering back to that mirror. The note. The flicker I thought I saw. What exactly did my mom want me to see? By midday, curiosity won. I told myself I was just looking for closure, or maybe some kind of explanation for why my mom spiraled so much in her final years. Whatever the reason, I found myself standing in front of the mirror again, like a moth drawn to a flame. This time, I didn't bother covering it with a sheet. I sat down in front of it, feeling foolish but determined, and stared at my reflection. At first, nothing happened. Just my own tired face looking back at me, bags under my eyes from another restless night. But then it started. It was subtle, like the way a shadow shifts when the sun moves behind a cloud. My reflection blurred for just a moment, then sharpened again, except it wasn't quite me anymore. The face looking back was mine, sure, but the expression was different, darker, angrier. And then the scene behind my reflection changed. I was no longer in the house. It was a memory. A vivid, almost dreamlike memory of me sitting in my high school cafeteria. I could see myself laughing with friends, but there was something off about it. I didn't remember this moment. And then I saw her, a girl sitting at a nearby table, clutching her tray like it was the only thing keeping her anchored. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. I knew her. Amy Carter. She was the quiet type, always sitting alone. In the mirror, I watched as my reflection turned to her and said something. I couldn't hear the words, but I could see the way Amy flinched, her face crumpling as she got up and left. The image disappeared as quickly as it came, leaving me staring at my own face again. My heart was racing, my palms sweaty. I sat back, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I didn't remember that moment, but it felt real. Too real. The rest of the day I couldn't concentrate on anything. My mom's old things sat untouched in their boxes as I paced the house, replaying the scene over and over in my head. Had I really said something cruel to Amy? I tried to convince myself it wasn't real, just some hallucination brought on by stress or lack of sleep. But deep down, I knew better. That night, the house felt even heavier than before. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, the silence thicker. I avoided the mirror like it was a live wire, but that didn't stop the memories. As I lay in bed, another image flashed behind my eyes. This time, I was back in my mom's garden, a place I hadn't thought about in years. I was 10, holding a pair of scissors and snipping the heads off her favorite flowers while she yelled from the porch. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. It wasn't just the images that scared me. It was the feelings they brought. The anger, the bitterness. They felt like mine, but distant, like echoes from another version of me. The next morning, I decided to visit the library. If I was going to figure out what was happening, I needed to start with the mirror itself. I remembered Martha mentioning something about it the night she came by, but I hadn't pressed her for details. The library was as small and dusty as I remembered, with an older woman at the front desk who looked like she hadn't aged a day since I was a kid. I told her I was researching old family artifacts and asked if there were any records about local antiques. She raised an eyebrow. "We don't get many questions like that around here. What are you looking for?" "An old mirror. It was passed down in my family and I was curious if there's anything special about it." Her face darkened. "You're Evelyn Simmons's daughter, aren't you?" I nodded, surprised. She hesitated, then leaned in close. "You're talking about the Simmons mirror, aren't you? That thing's got a history. Not a good one, mind you." She pointed me to a dusty archive section in the back of the library, where I found an article dated from the 1800s. It talked about an ornate mirror brought over from Europe by my great-great-grandfather. According to the article, the mirror was rumored to reveal truths and had been associated with misfortune ever since. One owner reportedly went mad, another disappeared, and another took his own life. I closed the article, my hands trembling. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. That night I stared at the mirror again, waiting for it to show me something else. I didn't have to wait long. This time the image was of me, standing in my mom's room, staring at her lifeless body. And for the first time I couldn't tell if it was just a memory or something more. That night I couldn't stay away. I felt like the mirror was calling me, pulling me in, daring me to look deeper. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the old wood beneath my feet as I made my way to my mom's bedroom. The air felt heavier the closer I got, like it was trying to push me back. When I opened the door, the mirror stood there in the dark, its gold frame glinting faintly in the moonlight. I hesitated, but eventually I stepped closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat in front of it, waiting. The reflection didn't move at first. It was just me, pale and scared, with shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. But then, like before, the edges of the glass rippled. This time it wasn't a single memory, it was a flood. I saw myself at different ages, doing things I didn't want to believe I was capable of. I saw the time I pushed a girl off the swing set in elementary school because she wouldn't give me a turn. I saw myself yelling at my mom during one of our countless teenage fights, telling her I hated her, that I wished I didn't have to live with her anymore. And then I saw the night she died. I was standing in her room, just as the last memory had shown me. She was lying on the floor, clutching her chest, gasping for air. She wasn't dead yet. She was begging me to call for help, but I didn't move. Instead, I just stood there, frozen, watching her struggle. Her voice cracked as she called my name, her hand reaching out toward me. And then she stopped moving. Her eyes stared up at me, wide and empty. The reflection didn't stop there. It showed me bending down, my hands trembling as I grabbed the mirror off the floor where it had fallen. For a moment, it was as if the mirror itself was watching me, absorbing everything. I placed it against the wall, my face blank, my body moving like it was on autopilot. And then, just as suddenly, the reflection disappeared, and I was staring at my own terrified face again. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That didn't happen. It's lying. It has to be." But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The mirror wasn't just showing me my past. It was showing me the parts I'd buried, the memories I couldn't face. the truth I'd been running from for years. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair in the process. The sound echoed through the room, but I barely noticed. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut on its own, the sound reverberating through the house. "Let me out!" I screamed, pounding on the door. Behind me, the mirror's surface began to ripple again. I turned to face it, my fear boiling into anger. "What do you want from me?" The answer came in the form of another vision. This time it was me as a little girl, sitting on the floor of this very room. My mom was standing over me, holding the mirror, her face pale and drawn. She was yelling something, her voice frantic and sharp. "You need to listen, Clara," she said, her voice echoing through the room as if it were coming from everywhere at once. "It's not just a mirror. It shows you. It makes you remember. And if you're not strong enough..." The scene cut off abruptly, and I was left staring at my reflection again. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy book from my mom's dresser, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass didn't break. It didn't even crack. Instead, the surface rippled again, and I felt a wave of cold air wash over me. The room seemed to darken, the shadows in the corners stretching out like long fingers. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the mirror's pull was stronger. It felt like it was reaching for me, dragging me toward it. I tried to resist, but my feet moved on their own, inching closer and closer until I was standing right in front of it. My reflection stared back, a twisted version of myself with hollow eyes and a cruel smile. "Why?" I whispered. "Why are you doing this?" The reflection's lips moved, but the voice wasn't mine. It was deeper, darker, and filled with a strange mix of anger and sorrow. "Because you need to remember. You need to face what you've done." Tears streamed down my face as I shook my head. I didn't mean to let her..." The mirror interrupted me with another ripple, and I was pulled into the memory again. This time it was clearer, sharper. I wasn't just watching, I was there. I felt the weight of the moment, the way my legs refused to move as my mom begged for help. I felt the anger I'd tried so hard to forget, the frustration I'd buried so deep it had turned into something uglier. And then I felt the guilt. When the vision ended, I was back in the room, crumpled on the floor. The mirror stood silent, its surface smooth and unassuming, like it hadn't just shattered my entire world. I stayed there for what felt like hours, too numb to move, too broken to cry anymore. But I knew one thing. I couldn't run from this. Not anymore. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. My mom reaching out to me, pleading, and me standing there doing nothing. By morning, I felt hollow, like there was nothing left of me but the guilt. The house seemed quieter, heavier. It felt like the mirror was waiting, like it knew I wasn't done yet. I couldn't avoid it anymore. This wasn't going to go away on its own. The mirror had dragged me to the edge of a cliff, and now it was my turn to decide. Face the truth or keep pretending it didn't happen. I walked back to my mom's room, my hands trembling. The air was cold, biting, and it only got worse the closer I got. When I opened the door, it was like stepping into a freezer. My breath came out in shaky puffs as I stood in front of the mirror one last time. For a long moment, nothing happened. Just me, staring at my reflection, pale and broken. But then the glass rippled, and I knew it was time. This time it didn't show me fragments, it showed everything. I was back in my mom's room that night, standing in the corner, my fists clenched. We'd been fighting. Again. I was yelling about how she never gave me space, how she was always so critical of me, how I couldn't wait to leave and never come back. She was crying, begging me to understand, but I didn't care. I just wanted her to stop. Then it happened. She gasped, clutching her chest, her face twisting in pain. She stumbled back, hitting the edge of the dresser before collapsing to the floor. "Clara," she whispered, her voice weak. "Call someone, please." But I didn't move. I stood there, frozen, watching her struggle. A part of me wanted to help, but another part, the part that was still so angry, held me back. By the time I snapped out of it, it was too late. She was gone. The vision ended, and I was back in the present, the weight of the truth pressing down on me like a stone. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I'm so sorry." Tears blurred my vision as I sank to my knees in front of the mirror. I didn't know who I was apologizing to, my mom, myself, or whatever force had brought me here. Maybe all of them. The mirror rippled again, but this time it didn't show me a memory. It showed my mom. Not as I'd seen her that night, but as she'd been before. Alive, smiling, warm. Her voice came soft and familiar. "Clara, I loved you. I always loved you. But you have to let go of this. You can't carry it forever." I reached out to touch the glass, but the image disappeared, leaving only my reflection. For the first time, it looked like me again. I took a deep breath and stood up, wiping the tears from my face. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the mirror and carried it outside, the morning air sharp and cold against my skin. The forest behind the house was quiet, except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I walked until I found a clearing, a spot where the light broke through the trees. Setting the mirror down, I picked up a heavy rock from the ground. My hands shook as I lifted it above my head, but I didn't hesitate. With all the strength I had left, I brought it down on the mirror. The sound was deafening, like glass and thunder and screams all at once. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, the shards catching the sunlight like tiny stars. For a moment, everything was still. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if the house and the forest had been holding their breath and were finally exhaling. I stood there, staring at the broken glass until I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't relief, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something. When I got back to the house, I packed my bags. There was nothing left for me there, nothing I wanted to hold on to. As I drove away, I didn't look back. But as the house disappeared in the rearview mirror, I could have sworn I saw something glinting in the window, just for a second. Maybe it was my imagination, or maybe the mirror wasn't finished with me yet. The moment I stepped onto the deck of the Ocean Star, I felt a strange pull in my chest. Maybe it was the salty breeze that hit me like a slap, or the way the endless expanse of water stretched out in every direction. But something felt off. I told myself it was just nostalgia, the kind that doesn't come with happy memories. Luke, my son, thought this cruise was a good idea. "You need a break, Dad," he'd said, handing me the ticket like he was offering me a lifeline. I didn't tell him that the sea was the last place I wanted to be. After all, I'd spent 40 years working on it, giving it every piece of myself. I thought I'd left it behind for good. But here I was. The ship was huge, a floating city bustling with families on vacation, honeymooners taking selfies and retirees playing shuffleboard. I wandered through it like a ghost, barely paying attention to the laughter and music around me. All I could focus on was the water, dark and endless. That first night, I found myself on the upper deck, staring out at the waves. It was quiet up there, away from the crowds. Just me, the stars, and the sound of the ocean. At least, that's what I thought. Then I heard it. At first it blended with the wind, a faint, high-pitched wail. I thought it might have been the engine, or maybe some bird I didn't recognize. But as I leaned over the railing, straining to hear, it grew louder. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a bird. It was a scream. A chill ran through me, colder than the ocean breeze. I scanned the water, but there was nothing there. Just the rhythmic slap of the waves against the ship. I tried to shake it off. "You're imagining things, Paul," I muttered, turning away from the railing. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, over a lukewarm cup of coffee in the dining hall, I decided to ask one of the crew about it. I caught a guy who looked like he'd been on ships longer than I'd been retired. Grizzled, weathered, the type who probably had more sea stories than anyone wanted to hear. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice casual. "I heard something weird last night. Sounded like screaming. Ever hear anything like that out here?" His face changed. It was subtle, just a flicker in his eyes, and the way his jaw tightened. But I saw it. He forced a grin. "The ocean's got its own voice," he said, shrugging. "You get used to it." "Right," I said, but his answer sat heavy in my gut. That night I heard it again, louder this time. I was back on the upper deck, the same spot as before. The screams cut through the wind, rising and falling like a desperate, mournful song. I leaned over the railing, gripping it so tight my knuckles turned white. "Hello?" I shouted into the darkness. My voice felt small, swallowed by the vastness of the sea. The screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating. I backed away from the railing, my heart pounding. When I turned around, I saw a member of the crew watching me from the shadows. It was the same guy I'd talked to earlier. "You shouldn't be out here at night," he said. "Why not?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. He hesitated, then said, "The sea's got its stories. Not all of them are for us to know." Before I could press him for more, he walked away, leaving me alone with the restless waves. I went back to my cabin, but the walls felt too close, the air too still. I needed answers, something to ground me, to make sense of what was happening. That's when I noticed it, a small leather-bound book lying on the desk near the window. I hadn't seen it before, and I sure as hell didn't bring it with me. Curious, I opened it. The pages were yellowed, the writing faded but legible. It was a diary, filled with scribbled notes about voyages and storms, names of ships, and strange happenings at sea. One entry stood out, written in bold, shaky letters. "They always come back, the ones you left behind." A knot formed in my stomach. I didn't want to believe it, but as I flipped through more pages, the names started to feel familiar. One in particular stopped me cold. Emily Wright. I hadn't thought about that name in years, but seeing it written there sent a flood of memories crashing over me, ones I'd buried deep. I slammed the diary shut and tossed it onto the desk. My hands were shaking. The screams came again that night, louder than ever, and this time they carried something new. My name. The screams were impossible to ignore now. They were louder, sharper, and they carried an edge of something that made my skin crawl, like desperation mixed with rage. Worse, I swore I could hear my name tangled in them, faint but unmistakable. That next day, I couldn't stop thinking about the diary. I kept turning over the name Emily Wright in my mind, trying to convince myself it wasn't the same Emily. It couldn't be. It had been decades since I last thought about her, and even longer since that storm. But the memory was creeping back in, piece by piece. I decided to confront the crew. I found Tom, the grizzled sailor I'd talked to before, leaning against the railing near the lifeboats, puffing on a cigarette. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, which made two of us. "You knew this would happen, didn't you?" I said, cutting straight to the point. He didn't even flinch. Just blew out a stream of smoke and stared out at the water. "You hear them again?" "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. He finally turned to look at me, his eyes heavy with something I couldn't quite place. Guilt, maybe, or resignation. "You can't run from it forever," he said. "The sea doesn't forget, and neither do they." "Who?" "The ones you left behind." I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a memory pushed its way to the surface. The rain pounding against the deck, the waves swallowing the boat whole, the screams of passengers who couldn't make it to the lifeboats in time. I did what I had to do, I muttered, almost to myself. Tom didn't respond. He just dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his boot, and walked away. That night, the screaming started earlier. I was lying in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, when the first wail echoed through the ship. It was closer this time, almost as if it were coming from inside the cabin. I jumped up, my heart hammering in my chest, and opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the sound was still there, louder now. I followed it, my bare feet slapping against the cold floor. It led me back to the deck, where the ocean seemed darker than usual, its surface rippling unnaturally. I leaned over the railing, and for the first time, I saw them. Dozens of them, maybe more, just beneath the surface. Pale, twisted, and staring up at me with hollow eyes. Their mouths opened and closed, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "You left us." I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. "No," I whispered. "This isn't real." But the faces didn't disappear. They just stared, waiting. And then one of them moved closer, breaking through the surface. It was Emily. Her hair floated around her face like seaweed, her skin a sickly gray. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. "You promised," she said, her voice echoing in my head. I fell to my knees, clutching the railing for support. "I couldn't save you," I said, my voice shaking. I tried, but there wasn't enough time. Her face didn't change, but her voice grew louder. "You didn't try hard enough." The other faces began to rise, their voices joining hers in a haunting chorus. "You left us. You left us." I don't know how long I stayed there, but eventually the voices faded, and the faces disappeared beneath the waves. Back in my cabin, the diary was waiting for me on the desk, even though I was sure I'd left it shut in a drawer. I opened it with trembling hands, flipping through the pages until I found a new entry that hadn't been there before. "The debt is paid in full when the sea takes everything." I slammed it shut and threw it across the room, but I knew it didn't matter. The screams weren't going to stop, and the sea wasn't going to let me go. I had to find out what it wanted before it was too late. That night, I didn't even bother trying to sleep. I sat on the edge of my bunk, staring at the door like it might burst open at any second. The ship creaked and groaned around me, but it wasn't the normal sounds of metal and waves. It felt alive, like the ship was breathing. The screaming started just after midnight. This time it wasn't distant. It was here, right outside my door. "Paul!" The voices called, soft at first, like a whisper carried by the wind. But then they grew louder, more insistent. "Paul!" I grabbed the diary from the desk, clutching it in my hands like it might give me answers. The pages seemed heavier now, as if they were soaked in seawater. Flipping through, I found another new entry written in the same bold, jagged script. They will take what you owe. The sea always collects. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the book. I shoved it back onto the desk and stumbled toward the door. I couldn't stay in that cabin any longer. The hallway was empty, but the air was thick with the sound of those screams. They echoed off the walls, surrounding me, pulling me toward the deck. My feet moved on their own, like I was being dragged by invisible hands. When I stepped outside, the night felt colder than it should have. The wind cut through my clothes and the waves were rough, crashing against the sides of the ship like they were trying to climb aboard. And then I saw them again. The faces in the water were clearer now, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They weren't just staring anymore. They were reaching, their hands clawing at the surface like they were trying to pull themselves free. At the center of it all was Emily. She floated just beneath the surface, her face twisted with anger and something worse. Betrayal. "You left us," she said, her voice cutting through the wind like a knife. "I didn't have a choice," I shouted, gripping the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. "There wasn't enough time." Her eyes narrowed and the waves surged higher, almost washing over the deck. "You chose yourself. You always chose yourself." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. She was right. Every time I'd been forced to make a choice at sea, whether to save a life or preserve my own, I'd chosen survival. I told myself it was the right thing to do, that it was what any sailor would have done. But standing there, staring at those faces, I couldn't believe my own excuses anymore. The voices grew louder, a chorus of accusations. "You left us! You left us!" "I'm sorry," I screamed, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry, okay? What else do you want from me?" Emily's head tilted and the voices fell silent. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the waves. Then she spoke again. "The sea doesn't want your words, Paul. It wants you." The water surged, and before I could react, a wave crashed onto the deck, knocking me off my feet. I hit the metal hard, my head spinning as cold seawater soaked through my clothes. When I looked up, they were there. The figures had pulled themselves onto the deck, their wet, skeletal forms shimmering in the moonlight. They moved slowly, deliberately, their hollow eyes locked on me. I scrambled to my feet, backing away until my back hit the railing. "Stay back!" I shouted, but my voice sounded weak, even to me. Emily stepped forward, her bare feet leaving puddles of water in her wake. "You took our lives," she said, her voice low and steady. "Now the sea will take yours." Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. The ship seemed to twist around me as I fled, the hallways stretching and shrinking like a nightmare. The walls dripped with seawater, and the floor beneath me felt unsteady, like it was ready to give way at any moment. I burst into the engine room, the heat and noise disorienting me. The shadows seemed to move on their own, and I knew they were coming. There was no escaping them. When I turned around, Emily was there. She stood in the doorway, her face calm, almost sad. "It's time, Paul," she said. "You can't run anymore." I fell to my knees, gasping for breath. "Please," I begged. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to leave you." She knelt in front of me, her cold hand resting on my shoulder. "The sea doesn't care about what you wanted. It only takes." Her grip tightened, and I felt the cold seep into my bones. The room around me blurred, the heat of the engine room fading into the icy chill of the ocean. The last thing I saw before everything went dark was her face, her hollow eyes staring into mine. I woke up on the deck, cold and soaked, with the ocean staring back at me. The ship was quiet, too quiet, like the world had gone still. My head pounded and my chest felt heavy, as if the weight of all those screams had settled there, crushing me. The faces in the water were gone, but I knew they hadn't left. They were waiting, watching. I sat up slowly, gripping the railing to steady myself. The horizon was dark, the sky blending seamlessly with the ocean. It was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. I heard footsteps behind me and turned, expecting to see one of the crew, but it was her. Emily stood at the other end of the deck, her hair wet and clinging to her face. She looked almost human now, but her eyes, those hollow, accusing eyes, burned with a cold fire. "It's time, Paul," she said, her voice softer than before but no less commanding. I shook my head, stepping back until I hit the railing. "What do you want from me?" "You already know," she said, taking a step closer. "The sea always takes what it's owed." "I've already given everything," I shouted, my voice cracking. "I gave my life to the sea. What more can it take?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Your life was never enough. You took ours. Now it's your turn." I looked down at the water, its dark surface rippling as if something beneath it was alive, breathing. I felt the pull, stronger now, almost irresistible. "You don't have to fight it anymore," Emily said, her voice almost gentle. "This is how it ends." A part of me wanted to argue, to beg for another chance, but deep down, I knew she was right. I had run from this for too long, made excuses, justified every decision. But the truth was simple. I had left them behind. I turned back to Emily, my chest tightening as I spoke. "Will it stop? The screams, will they stop if I go?" She didn't answer. She just stepped aside, leaving the path to the edge of the ship clear. The wind picked up as I walked toward the railing, carrying the faint echoes of their voices. "Paul," they whispered, over and over like a chorus pulling me closer. I climbed onto the railing, the metal cold beneath my hands. The sea seemed calmer now, almost inviting. I turned my head one last time, looking at Emily. She stood silently, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought I saw something else in her eyes. Not anger, but sadness. "Goodbye," I said, more to myself than to her. And then I jumped. The water hit me like ice, stealing the breath from my lungs. For a second, I panicked, thrashing against the pull of the waves. But then I felt it, the weight of everything I'd done, dragging me down, deeper and deeper. The screams grew louder, surrounding me, filling every corner of my mind. But this time, they weren't accusing, they were welcoming. As the darkness closed in, I saw their faces again. Emily was there, her hand outstretched, her expression softening into something almost like forgiveness. And then it was over. The Ocean Star continued its voyage, its passengers none the wiser. The crew whispered among themselves about the old man who had disappeared, but no one talked about the screams that had haunted the ship for nights. For those who ventured to the upper deck after dark, some claimed they could still hear the faint echo of a name carried on the wind. Paul. The sea had taken what it was owed, and as always it remained silent about the rest.